Hello, bienvenue. Welcome, Dalhousie Goy. My name is Laura Rainsborough, and I'm the Director of Food for All New Brunswick that has the pleasure of hosting today's webinar, Digging into Food and Climate. Food and climate connect in many, many ways. It can be a complex journey of trying to make those connections and understand how they all connect. And so we're very excited to be presenting three panelists today who will share their insights into the intersections of food and climate change. Today's presentation will be all presented in English. For those who are attending live today, there's live interpretation available through your Zoom settings. And for those who are joining in, welcome, and we look forward to getting started. So let me begin with a land acknowledgement that here we are in the province of New Brunswick, which covers the territories of the Wolastoqey, the Passamaquoddy, and the Mi'kmaq peoples. It is governed by the peace and friendship treaties that were established between the Crown and the Wabanaki Confederacy tribes. And yet, here this context is also a context of colonialism and of injustices, of environmental racism. And these affect our food in many, many ways. So I invite us all to reflect on the land in which we are having these conversations, and to bring the spirit of the peace and friendship treaties into our conversation as we consider not only climate change, but climate justice. And so welcome everybody to this session on digging into food and climate. We have three speakers with us today, Prado, Nicole Arsenault, and Louise Comeau, all who bring such wealth of experience and expertise when we look at food and climate change, which is not a simple single issue. This is quite complex. And so that's why we need to dig into it to really get into those deeper conversations and explore what it means in our personal lives for our food choices and bigger systems change. How can food better establish a stronger action on climate change more systemically? So welcome all. Without further ado, I would like everybody who's live on the event today to feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. This is a good way to see who's in the room, to get to know each other, and maybe even add in something about what brings you to this conversation today. And as was mentioned, if you have any questions that are coming up through the presentations, please feel free to add them into the chat box, and I'll try my best to get to them as we head into moderated discussion. So each speaker will have a few minutes to make a presentation. We'll open up some of that conversation into a moderated discussion afterwards. And so it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Prado. Originally from Montreal, moved to northwestern New Brunswick in September of 2017. As part of his work in his role as Territorial Analyst for the Northwest Regional Service Commission, he is developing a regional climate change adaptation plan for the communities of the region, analyzing regional data and networking with various provincial and regional organizations and collaborators. Holds 3 degrees from McGill University, and in addition to his passion for the environment, he's interested in social issues and the democratization of science, information, and technology. He sits on many committees, including the steering committee for Food for All New Brunswick. Over to you,
Thanks for the introduction, Laura. So I guess I'll just start sharing my screen. Oops. Okay. So hopefully that's displaying properly. My talk today is going to be about the impacts of climate change on food in New Brunswick. As you'll figure out from the talk, there's a bit of a lack of data on this, so at least that I've been able to come across.
So I'm not seeing the screen yet.
Oh,
your slides.
Okay. That's
Is that true for others as well? Yeah.
Okay, so I'll try to. Okay, I see. So
that's just making it a real webinar by having
some exactly.
Tech issues. So thank you. We're now there.
Okay, perfect. I'll be talking about the impact of climate change on food in New Brunswick. So just to get things started, first let's get what is climate change in a nutshell? So as greenhouse gas concentrations increase in the atmosphere due to human activities for the most part, more heat gets retained near the planet's surface, and that causes warming in average annual temperature, which leads to all kinds of other impacts on precipitation and different meteorological systems. And so that tendency over multiple years is what we call climate change. So what are the impacts? As I just mentioned, primarily we see an increase in annual average temperature. There's also changes to precipitation regimes. I'm putting up this slide here, and you'll note that there's some areas that are that experience different amounts of change than others. And interestingly enough, a lot of those are places that food comes from, at least that we rely on for food. So you can look at California, Mexico, for example, Chile, South Africa, etc. And they are disproportionately affected by reduction in average precipitation, which is what we see in this map here. And so this is the tendency from present day to under two different scenarios. This is the low emission scenario, and this is a higher emission scenario. So in the lower emission scenario, we can see that the impacts are lesser, and in the higher emission scenario, we can see that they're greater. There's also an impact to the frequency of extreme weather events, floods, for example, droughts, forest fires, ice storms, etc. And so some of these images are actually from New Brunswick. We can see flooding in Fredericton right here, as well as the ice storm that occurred in the Acadian Peninsula. And as we're aware, there's more and more forest fires going on across the world. And so these are from Alberta. So there's also increases in sea levels, and some areas may become more or less hospitable, for the most part, less hospitable to humans and other animals and plants. So how might this impact food globally? So there's a lot of uncertainty, but it's likely that food chains will be disrupted. And so I come back to this same map here, where we see that a lot of the locations where we obtain food from in North America are going to be adversely affected by drought or reduction in precipitation, which could affect supply. According to the IPCC and the report that they released in 2019, crops are already yielding less at lower latitudes and more at higher latitudes. And more crops, particularly fruits and vegetables, are expected to decline further as a result of various factors, including drought, pathogens, etc. Food prices are also expected to rise, which we know disproportionately affects the already vulnerable people of the planet. And nutrient content in some foods is expected to also decline as a result of increased CO2 levels in the atmosphere. So what does this mean for New Brunswick specifically? A substantial portion of fruits and vegetables in New Brunswick are imported, and some sources say up to 90%. So here I've linked a report from forget the name of the group, but they're based in Southeast, and so they released a report on food security. Food security would be affected as well by this sort of thing. So when we look at food security, we talk about availability, access, stability, and utilization. And we can expect adverse impacts to all four of these elements. This is kind of an interesting kind of notion that's coming out of some of the effects that we see on related to climate change. So as forest fires have increased, we're also seeing that smoke can be a potential infectious agent for as it transports microorganisms across large distance. So that could lead to not only health effects, but also effects and impacts on food safety. In terms of the growing season, you'll probably hear a lot about how the growing season is expected to get longer in North America. So what does this mean for New Brunswick specifically? Oh, now I can't control. Okay, there we go. So we're also expecting that the growing season should be longer. And so that's something that's often raised as an impact in North America, for example. But we're also expecting to see more frequent droughts, later frosts in the spring and fall, as well as more extreme weather events. So how that would impact productivity is a bit up in the air. Here's a map that showcases some data from Arsenault, and you can find this on our website at csrno.ca, and I think the link will be shared. But so as we can see here, this is a map of growing season length in New Brunswick. The lighter areas are less in terms of length, and the darker areas are longer. So currently, the growing season in New Brunswick is about 160 to 180 days, depending on where you are in the province. In 2080, under RCP 8.5 scenario, which is the higher emission scenario, we expect that it could increase to about 220 to 240 days per year, which is a pretty significant increase. In terms of suitability mapping, so these are maps that are produced by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in terms of determining where crops can be grown with greater success. So they produce some maps for alfalfa, soy, springstone, small grains, and corn. And you can see here I've shown a couple of examples. So in terms of soy suitability, historically, we see that this is about the range that soy can be grown, with the green areas being the ones where you can get some reasonable yield. And in 2085, if the soils are improved and irrigated, we can expect that that area would expand. But if agricultural practices are unimproved and left as rain-fed, we would actually see a decline in suitability area. Similarly, and so this is kind of the more extreme example, alfalfa currently and historically, so 1995 versus 2085 for improved and irrigated versus unimproved and rain-fed. So this is usually used as a rotational crop or a feed crop. So it could be something to keep in mind. But it would be interesting to see what that means for other types of crops. If we continue, there should also be impacts to erosion, specifically due to runoff, for example, where we're expecting about 15 to 20% increase in average annual precipitation, which in some cases can lead to erosion. There could be possible sources of wild food contamination. So we can go back to the recent floods, and fiddleheads were affected by the floodwaters. So that's something also to consider. There's the possibility of new pests moving in, whether they're agricultural or forestry related or human related pests and parasites. And we can expect to see increased soil mineralization as a result of higher temperatures. And so that increases microbial activity in soils. And so that can change a lot of the way that we grow food. So in conclusion, the best solution is to avoid getting there. And so maybe mitigation is something to consider. As discussed in the IPCC document, so that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, 21 to 37% of global greenhouse emissions are related to food. And individuals typically have some agency and control over what they eat, so it could be an important source or an important avenue for mitigation. Also, increased food sovereignty can help deal with some of the food security issues that are related to climate change, so it's also an avenue to explore. And so thanks for listening, and sorry for the technical difficulties. Hopefully it didn't detract too much from the message.
It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, our next presenter, Nicole Arsenault. Nicole is an interdisciplinary PhD candidate at Dalhousie University in the School for Resource and Environmental Studies. Past research includes quantifying the environmental impacts of dairy farming systems in Nova Scotia and Pacific salmon fishing systems using life cycle assessment, studying the impact of cultural and historical mediating factors on formal and non-formal science education settings, and assessing the disease load and overall health of honeybee colonies in Atlantic Canada. So all sorts of amazing connections into food through climate change. Her current PhD research involves modeling the environmental impacts of future food consumption and production scenarios for Canada, with the goal of demonstrating possible pathways to a more sustainable food system for Canada. Nicole, thank you for presenting. Over to you.
Thanks, Laura, and thanks, Adrian. I think you'll be hearing from me because I think I'm going to need your expertise as I draft these future scenarios. It'd be great to have some chats in the future. So I'll just share my screen. Can everybody see that? Yeah.
Okay. Yes, that's great, Nicole.
It's currently in your presentation or in your view. So if you just switch to presentation mode.
Here we go. All right. All right. I'm just going to move this down. All right. So yeah, today I thought I would speak a little bit about then how we who are trying to kind of figure out what are the contributions of the food system to these local and global scale environmental impacts, including contributions to climate change. How can we approach those kinds of questions? How can we approach questions about how we can change systems or alter our food consumption and what the potential impact might be on reducing or increasing impacts are. So my presentation is themed around an approach called life cycle thinking and its connection to climate change work and the food system. Oh, it's not advancing. Okay, here we go. So just in really general terms, life cycle thinking refers to a sustainability management approach that is predicated on considering all relevant supply chain interactions associated with a good, a service, activity, or entity. So when we're thinking about a food product from a life cycle perspective, we'll think about it, we'll go all the way back to all the resource extraction that's required to support that food production system, the activities on the farm, the activities, the impacts associated with transport, with processing, with the retail setting and the consumer setting and the end of life setting. And we'll try to take into account all the material and energy flows into and out of that system and emissions from that system to the environment. And when we're using these tools to compare different alternative systems or ways of approaching production, it can help to lead to a better understanding of potential trade-offs or the shifting of environmental burden from one area to another that could be associated with system change, so that we can hopefully answer the question, you know, what are some better paths going forward? But as you are no doubt all aware, the food system is complex. When I was talking about those material and energy flows through food production systems, I was beginning, and the different life cycle stages, I was beginning to articulate some of the dimensions of the food system. So I thought I would include this diagram here, which is complex enough, but really is highly simplified nonetheless. Look at what exactly the food system is. And these can be global scale food systems, nation scale, region scale, province scale, community scale, but they would all have these different elements, the four main dimensions being a farming system, an economic system, social and cultural context, and all the surrounding environment that underpins and in which all of this is embedded. And there are numerous complex interactions, feedback loops associated with the different dimensions of the food system. And so changes to one area that we might make to address a particular environmental impact, for example, maybe the toxic effects of pesticides. Changes in one section of the system can have many often counterintuitive and unintended impacts elsewhere. So if we are able to expand the boundaries of our analysis to ask questions about what the impacts might be of changes to the system, then we might be able to try to take some of those unintended impacts or trade-offs into account. I'm having trouble, there we go. So what does this all mean when we're thinking about climate change and the food system? Well, as I alluded to before, figuring out how we can change our food system in order to make it more sustainable is a tricky undertaking, and it's fraught with a lot of complexity and a lot of uncertainty. And indeed, climate change as an issue it's a biophysical, it's a scientific issue, it's a physical phenomenon that we experience in our world, but it is also very much a social problem. It stems from how we view our place in the world and how we see ourselves in relation to nature. And so it's very thorny and uncertain kind of question to be asking. But change is urgently needed. So Adrian, in very great detail, talked about the impacts of climate change on our food production system and ended by talking about the impacts of our food production system on climate change. And it definitely goes both ways. Approximately, 20 to 30, one paper says 26%, but these are all approximate measures of humanity's greenhouse gas emissions globally come from the food production. So that some of that is from the burning of fossil fuels associated with food production, transport, but also emissions directly from soil and from the animals and their manure. But our food systems are actually also really, really important contributors to other impacts globally as well. So the big one is biodiversity loss. And by some estimates, our food system, so that includes the cultivation and production of foods through agricultural terrestrial systems, but also the harvest of wild species, in particular marine species, fisheries, is responsible for 70 to 80% of the species lost over the past century. And a big driver of that is the conversion of wildlands to agricultural land globally. So when we're trying to figure out how do we change our food systems to address climate change, we also have to be taking into account the other impacts of those food systems, because we otherwise may find ourselves contributing more to other impacts in our attempt to address climate change. So what are some big takeaways from this sort of life cycle thinking so far? As Adrian alluded to, what we eat matters very much. Not all foods are created equal, I like to say. What research is showing is that across all impacts, animal-based foods are more resource intensive and contribute far more to impacts, including climate change, than do plant-based foods in general. But also, so what we eat matters. And also how that food is produced matters a lot. But it's perhaps not simple to point to one production system as being better than others, because there isn't one that necessarily performs better than the others across all kinds of environmental impacts. So that's another tricky bit. And then the other thing to keep in mind is that there aren't going to be simple, easy to implement global food sustainability solutions, that we have to take into account the local context, socio-cultural and economic realities of people around the world, and also the biophysical context of people around the world. So what potential for food production exists where we have different people living? As Adrian pointed out, the impacts of climate change on food production are going to be felt most severely by people in the global south, even though those people in general have contributed orders of magnitude less to this problem than those of us in the global north. And that's going to have impacts on our food supply as well. And so those impacts will be felt globally, but most severely by the people there. And so local context has always to be taken into account when we're trying to design solutions. And then at the same time, we need to be thinking, what are the contributions of those local systems to global environmental impacts like climate change and biodiversity loss? So that's it for me. I'll stop sharing my screen. How do I unshare?
Thank you so much, Nicole.
Pause share. Stop share. Sorry, I'm just trying to figure out how to unshare. Okay, I got it.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you for that presentation. I am excited to get into the discussion a little later. I think there's a lot of food for thought there. And I would like to just send out a short reminder about interpretation. Donc, si vous avez nous rejoint et vous avez besoin de l'interprétation, il y a un petit globe dans votre menu de Zoom pour accéder à l'interprétation. Donc, s'il vous plaît, utilisez-le si ça vous plaît. Okay, so it's now my pleasure to introduce our third and final speaker, Louise Comeau. Louise is an honorary research associate and an instructor at the University of New Brunswick and an environmental consultant. In her role as an environmental consultant, Louise directs the Conservation Council of New Brunswick's Climate Change and Energy Program and works with Nature Canada on nature-based climate solutions. Dr. Comeau has almost 30 years experience in analyzing and developing climate change policy, communications, and solutions-related programming. She holds a doctorate in environmental management, focused on environmental ethics and behavior change from UNB. Louise lives in Keswick Ridge with her partner Tom, where they homestead and engage with students through site visits and teaching and research at the University of New Brunswick. She has received 2 Queen's Citizenship medals for her work in international climate negotiations and in the creation of the Green Municipal Fund and other sustainability programming with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. Thanks for joining us today, Louise. Over to you.
Great. I'm assuming you can see the screen? Yes, everybody? Yep. We're all good? Excellent. I just want to make sure before I go charging ahead. So maybe we could set this last part of our conversation up around the idea of how does a climate change campaigner eat? So let me give you a quick overview of what I want to share with you. I want to talk to you about, while I do know very much about climate change risks, climate change impact, climate change projections, I want to talk to you about not those things, not numbers in the sense of tons or things like that, but I want to talk about love and art. For the Love of New Brunswick is a series of videos and a portal we've created at the Conservation Council to bring the idea of climate change to New Brunswickers, but from the dimension of what they care about. So we talk to people, they tell us what they love to do, and then we share how that affects climate change. I'll show you a video from that. We've also been involved in a project with an organization called Futures Forward and bringing art now to this conversation about climate change. And I'm delighted to see Mario de Wairon is on the call today because he was also part of the project, but I'm going to show you something related to that. It's currently showing at the UNB Art Center and a huge, huge success. We'll share with you a bit more about that. I want to talk about the opportunity for us to have new relationships with food and maybe talk a bit about what I see as food citizenship. So let me just show you one little video here. This, in fact, is part of our neighborhood. We did 12 videos and half of them are all about food. And you can find these on our web portal, which is, I provide the link for you and it'll be in the chat box. And I just want to give you just a little sense of this approach to thinking about climate change.
I like going around in the woods and collecting sap. I like being outdoors here and building forts and hanging around the evaporator.
Every spring we tap our sugar bush and it's time to be with family and friends and in the woods.
It makes a nice sound on the metal as it hits the bottom.
So what we're trying to do with these videos is obviously make things local. We know that if we're going to tell stories about climate change, we need to make them relevant to people where they live. This series is about that. It's about bringing that kind of feeling. I live with climate change every single day, I think more acutely than I ever have in the past, because I've actually tried to come in alignment with natural rhythms and grow my own food. We'll talk quickly about that. When we do syrup, I'm nervous. I'm nervous that, you know, is spring going to come too quickly? Is it going to get too warm? Are we going to have the production that we depend on? So it makes it for a live engagement around the issue as opposed to something I'm doing more analytically. This is a video that brings food to this story through our art show, as I mentioned, that is currently playing at the UNB Art Center. 12 amazing people are participating. Mario's work is amazing. You can sign up to go look at the show, but it will also be online shortly. We're going to have an open house on March 25th, and so stay tuned for that. But let me just show you this lovely offering here.
Greetings, my name is Josephine Savarese and I've had the pleasure of being part of the From Harm to Harmony community-based arts project with the Conservation Council of New Brunswick.
My name is Dirk Grunberg, I'm the farmer here and I'm sharing some seeds that we can put in the piñata.
This is a Seeds of Hope box.
Yeah, so these are seeds that I've used in years past. This is an onion seed package.
So all these you're donating to the Seeds of Hope box?
Yeah, I've even have some morning glory seeds.
Those look pretty hopeful to me.
I grew up in a farm. I've always been farming or working in farming, and this is what I like, growing food for people.
As kids, we each had a garden plot assigned to each of our names. And so that gave me an appreciation of the natural world and the environment.
As a farmer, I feel that I am an artist because I'm creating every year new crops, and I really like the way crops develop. It's an artful thing.
So we live in a world that's experiencing a lot of harm right now. And it's the hope that this art project will promote ideas about harmony and rejuvenating the natural world.
By growing organic foods, by using the land appropriately, we can save a lot of stuff.
When I think about the environment, I feel a sense of despair, but I also do feel a sense of hope consistent with this box and the seeds of hope.
If we change our ways now, we can still save the earth. That's a big promise for the coming summer.
We're going to do some artistic designs on the box and offer it to the community as the promise for the future, from harm to harmony.
So let me just build from that kind of positive emotion dynamic that we're obviously paying a lot of attention to, partly because the research I do shows that we can get people's attention with risk and concern and worry and anger, but more positive emotions are needed to sustain commitment over time. I've also learned that in order for us to get to the places we're talking about in terms of a different relationship with food, we actually have to change a couple of cultural dimensions, personal, but I think culturally imposed on us. And that is this perception that we have of time, that we don't have time for food. We don't have time to grow it, to prepare it, to enjoy it, to share it. We've got to always be fast food and in a rush. And I think if we're going to actually get in tune with food and climate change, we actually have to slow down and give ourselves permission to spend time preparing food, growing food, being with food, and nurturing that care ethic. We're also trained culturally to be thinking about money. It's got to always be the cheapest food. But we know, just as Adrian and Nicole have described, there are a lot of environmental, social externalities related to food, as with so many issues. And so we really do need to give ourselves permission to spend more sometimes on food, even though we may not spend more overall. I certainly spend more time and more money on certain parts of my food choices, but I also make sure we waste less. Obviously, we're composting and so on, but we also eat smaller portions, especially if it's related to things like meat. This is what my garden looks like, and I wanted to share that partly because of this, to me, is very much a climate change story. It's a climate change story in terms of how I grow food when we're dealing with drought, but it's also a food security, food sovereignty issue. I want to know that I've got food in the house, that it's part of my effort to be prepared for extreme events and so on. Now, obviously, not everybody has to go as far as we have. I have an incredible privilege to be where I am and to be able to do this. But to whatever degree we can, even when I lived in a very small condominium and I went to the farmer's market, I only had a little tiny community garden plot. I still prepared and processed and preserved all sorts of food, and created a cold room, even in a tiny or shared, storage space for food. This is a bit of an overkill for many of you, but we are trying to be almost self-sufficient in our food. And as I mentioned, we process food and so on. Obviously, for me to do that, I've had to adjust my life in order to live a lower impact life. And that means I cram my work hours into fewer days of the week to save me as many days of the week as I can for growing food. And everybody that I work with knows that they have to come find me in the garden during the summer. There's also opportunities around food citizenship I want to highlight in this new relationship that we require with food. And that means letting politicians, food producers, and farmers know what your expectations are around food, whether that's locally supplied, whether that's with lower inputs, organic, all of those dimensions. We have to enter into conversation. And we know through social science research that talking to friends and family about what's on your mind, in this case, the topic is food, so I'm saying food interest, but if you don't talk about climate change and food, people won't know that it matters to you. So really super important. But so is voting with food in mind, writing letters, sharing on social media, and so on. So people can connect with you if you're sharing your passion for food. That's contagious, and they can engage with you in a way that they might not have done in the past. And one of the reasons why I think it's an entry point to a conversation with people about climate change, because we often try to avoid it. We think that it's a contentious issue. Everybody eats. So food is really super democratic. No matter where you are, whether it's, stage of life, whether it's your income, education, and so on. And I deal with this with my students all the time. The one thing they do is eat, and it's the one thing they can take control of, even in an environment where they may not own a car, or they don't, which is great, or they may live in an apartment and can't do anything about their energy use and so on. They can do stuff about food. And so it is a way to start that conversation and to engage, and to do so in a way that people then can build out from over time. So let me just stop there and allow us to get to questions. There's a link to the portal, and I also included the link to the art show. And thank you for your time. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Louise. Thank you to all three of our panelists. We will be moving into some questions, getting to some conversation around this. If anybody needs to duck out, then we'll be putting the link to the survey, so we can gather your feedback on today's webinar, on the parts of it that we were able to control. And so please, you'll see that survey. There it is. The survey link has come up. So please click that now. It'll open up and you can fill it in whenever you're ready. And we will go just a few minutes over to allow for some conversation. So if anybody needs to duck out, no worries. This will be recorded and shared on YouTube. So thank you again to our three panelists. Great information, framing up these big issues, understanding how this really hits home here in New Brunswick. What will the effects be? And, we weren't looking that far into the future. I think 2085 can sometimes sound like very far away, but we know how time passes. This will come actually fairly quickly, and the window to be able to act is quite urgent, as Nicole was mentioning. When we look at the life cycle assessment, yes, there is so much complexity there. And Louise has reminded us that food, though complex, is a very meaningful way in. When we may be choosing some of the bigger decisions in our lives that affect climate change, like where we are sourcing our energy from, for example, we will research the topic, we will look into options, we will see where government programs are encouraging us to put our energy. And with food, we are making those decisions much more frequently in our daily lives. And so I love Louise's suggestion there of how does a climate change campaigner eat? And we heard her take on that. And yet, to build out a pantry the size of yours, Louise, we may not have quite that same window of time, each and every one of us. So I'd like to put that question back to Age and Nicole. What runs through your mind as you were making decisions on what to eat?
I guess I'll start. So I've been an ovo-vegetarian and vegan for about 10 years now, and ovo-vegetarian for 5 years before that. Mainly out of concern for my impact on the climate and animal welfare as well. So that definitely affects how I eat. Definitely try to go for fresh foods or frozen foods rather than processed foods, mainly because there's a whole added level of processing and energy involved in that, and try to eat lower on the food pyramid. So which I guess all vegetables and fruits would account for that. So that's, and I try to also eat a lot of legumes because they're high in terms of nutritional content. So, and they heal the soil as well by fixing nitrogen. So that's it.
Yeah, it's a pretty similar answer for me. I've also I've been a vegetarian to varying degrees through my life. While I was pregnant, that kind of went off the rails, and then for a few years after. And now I'm back to, certainly one thing that's never changed is that I don't eat red meat and have very limited intake of dairy. Those are the things I concentrate on. So in the hierarchy of foods that are highest impact to lowest impact, certainly ruminant-based foods, beef, lamb, goat, and dairy are the big heavy hitters, which is often a sad story for people to hear because they are also delicious. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that they are delicious and that the choices are not easy because, as Louise said, food is it's not just fuel or nourishment, it is also cultural and comfort and lots of things to us. So I try definitely to live a lowest impact diet for myself, but also to not be too hard on myself when I just need to treat myself, because I think that there's a degree of scale that we can work with it. And interesting life cycle studies have shown that even, you know, if we could achieve a 50% decrease population scale, that would make a big difference, a 50% decrease in these high impact animal foods. So, you know, I try to meet people where they are. Not everybody's going to eat the way I eat. My own husband and son don't eat the way I eat. But we can make change in an incremental way, and our personal actions do very much matter while we're fighting for change. Unrelated to food, the other thing that I am trying always to raise awareness about is that underpinning all of this is that we have an economic system that's fueled by growth, and if it's not growing, it's not working, and that makes no biophysical sense. And there's just in the past year, there have been some incredible empirical studies just trying to put to rest this question of, you know, is green growth possible? This idea of growth, which is so sticky for us because we really want to believe that it's possible, but the empirical evidence is just overwhelmingly, you know, a definitive. It's not possible. And so I am kind of radical in my thinking about food futures and wonder if we should even consider food a public good paid for by our taxes. And, you know, maybe all farmers could be salaried. So I'm also really radical in how I think about food as part of an economic system that is fundamentally flawed and no longer serving our purposes. So through my own eating decisions and also through how I think about the world, I'm trying to make these changes.
That's so great to hear. And I put you both on the spot with that question. You didn't necessarily need to disclose what you eat, but I so appreciate that you described the thinking behind. It helps to kind of know how to navigate through those kinds of decisions. And Nicole, you said it so well that it points to the bigger systems actors who can have even greater influence. Doesn't have to be incremental when there are large public policy decisions being made. And so that is my next question. And I see comments coming up in the chat box as well, talking about animal proteins and fitting into the bigger picture. I think that a theme I'm hearing through today's conversation is just how we cannot see any of our food systems through a single issue, that complexity of our food systems is actually what points to it as being sort of a microcosm of our larger world. And so with that, we get the opportunity to consider social justice, to consider how our economics play out, to consider how we are with one another and with the land through our food. So thanks for the messages, the comments coming up. Please ask questions. Please feel free to use the chat box in the remaining minutes that we have. So with this question about systems change, what is the single biggest action that you want to see happen at the systems level? Pick any system that you want and go for it. So I'll turn this over first to Louise.
I was thinking hard, that's a hard question. So, I mean, in terms of the work I do, I'm focused on energy systems and on electrification as one of the core ways we're going to solve climate change. From a food perspective, I really, energy is part of it. Let me be blunt. I think the agriculture community has escaped regulation where it should not have escaped regulation. And they do that, yeah, I won't go into all the claims that get made, but I would like to see agricultural inputs be more regulated, whether that's or at least regulated to the degree that on a life cycle basis, greenhouse gas emissions have to come down. So I'm thinking of things like, methane in terms of manure management. I'm thinking of the fossil fuel components associated with fertilizer production and utilization, and what happens in terms of soil and so on. And so, yeah, I do think there are things that need to be done. And for some reason, the farming or agriculture sector has escaped regulation, and I think that needs to change.
I can maybe add a point to that. I think a lot of that stems from the fact that farmers themselves are often overworked and underpaid and offering an essential service that's difficult to fund better ecological practices for. And I think, going back to Nicole's point about having it, be a public service, definitely makes a lot of sense to me as well. I think treating agricultural land as a common good and a service that every citizen requires, every citizen needs, and being able to then regulate, the inputs and outputs of an agricultural land in the system of, whether it's a watershed or the greater ecological area would definitely help, So I've heard from farmers that say, we try to get funds for certain improvements, and then we get funding for a year and we can't complete the project, and it doesn't deliver on what we really need. And you hear about farmer suicides, for example. You hear about all these different impacts from being overworked, being stressed by different weather conditions, lower yields one year, higher yields another, and having to deal with all that uncertainty is a lot for small businesses, really. That's what it is. It's a small business, and they need to absorb these costs. And so having public funding invested and treating it really as a public good and public service might help to that front.
Thanks, H. Nicole, did you want to add big systems change or wishes to the list?
Yeah, I actually, I agree with both Louise and Adrian that regulation is needed, but then on the other side of that, incentivization is needed to support farmers as they change. Having spent 2 years as a dairy farm manager, dairy farm herd manager, before I even thought of sort of modeling the environmental impacts of those systems, I was there on the ground and understanding the sort of the incredible creativity and the impulse to tinker and experiment that all good farmers have, and to capitalize on that and incentivize that and use their knowledge to help us move forward, I think is very, very important. But underpinning that, I think, is what I said before. I think we very quickly need to move to a post-growth economy. We need to give up on fairy tales of perpetual economic growth. It puts our farmers on a hamster wheel where they are incentivized to exploit their farmland as much as possible simply in order to survive and feed their own families, which is quite perverse. So there are some underpinning problems which, if they are not addressed first, they make the rest of our challenge just so much harder. The pursuit of perpetual growth while we're trying to bring down emissions to the degree that we need to. So 50% by 2025, 2030, and down to net zero by 2050 is a huge challenge. And the shape of that curve is pretty much vertical. So from here to there. And so pursuing growth at the same time as if it's possible makes this task too difficult, in my opinion. So recognizing and protecting those public goods on which we require for survival and putting into place the incentivization programs that we need to support improvement in production. And then the actual biggest lever we can pull right now is the one that Adrian and Louise and I, all three of us, talked about, is reducing the amount of animal foods we're eating today. You know, it's a huge lever, and it's very difficult to say this is how you should be eating, and I would never do that. But I will say, if you're concerned about climate change, this is what you can do today. It's huge. So those are my three.
Fantastic. Thank you to all three of our panelists, to Prado, to Nicole, Arsenault, and to Louise Comeau. Thank you all so much for sharing your knowledge with us today, for diving into these questions together. I have so many more questions. I want to know what we're learning from COVID-19 when it comes to food and climate change. I want to know, where is this conversation at in New Brunswick, and what's needed to help shift that further? Yes, I have so many more questions. And yet, this is the beginning. This is an opening of a conversation. I do feel that we collectively will find many ways to advance this conversation further. And so that is one piece that Louise has mentioned previously, is about how to have a conversation, how to move this into a conversation. That can be an action that can continue to advance this work. And I think there can be many ways, especially about how we might handle the overwhelm of these issues. So there can be even just small actions that we can each take to be able to reflect and to consider how this work moves forward and how it will impact our actions and the systems changes we want to see. Getting rid of those fairy tales, but also dreaming up those food futures together. So thank you everybody for joining in today. Thank you to my colleagues with Food for All and Bee for putting together the nuts and bolts of today's session. I want to remind you that you can stay in contact with Food for All New Brunswick. We've put a link in the chat box about different ways to do that. We have a New Brunswick food programs map. We have a resource directory. We run a program called Community Food Mentors Program of New Brunswick. There are many ways in which you can bring these issues further in your work, so please do stay in touch. A reminder to fill out the survey. We love to learn from your feedback and improve our next webinars. There will be more webinars in our future, so stay tuned. So thank you again, everybody, and I wish you a wonderful day.